The reading came back wrong, and Drevik had 6 minutes to find out why. Day 25. Corridor Solen entry vector bearing 7 Mark II. His scan console returned the same flat signature it always returned this deep in the corridor: mineral dust, trace ionization, the background hum of a formation that had been sitting in the same place for roughly 4 billion years. And then underneath all of that, something else. A resonance, present on every bearing simultaneously. That was not possible for a natural formation. Drevik ran it again. The second pass returned the same result. He checked the array calibration, nominal. He checked the sensor log for interference artifacts, none flagged. The resonance sat there on his screen, distributed and even, touching every bearing at once the way light touches a room, and his classification window had already burned through 40 seconds while he stared at it. No alarm, no warning signal, no classification. He did not call for backup. Calling for backup meant admitting he didn't know what he was looking at, and Drevik had been on scan duty in Corridor Solen for 11 months without a single unclassified reading. The console fan hummed. The dust turned slowly outside the viewport. He began working through the natural formation catalog manually, starting with distributed resonance patterns from known geological phenomena, because there had to be an answer in the catalog, and he simply hadn't found it yet. 4 minutes passed. At the 4-minute mark, 3,100 platforms completed. 25 days earlier, archivist Pelu Dren of the Tessavin Observer Corps had noted, in the official record, that the air in Threshold assembly smelled faintly of something old. This was not a poetic observation. Dren did not make poetic observations in her official log. The smell was mineral, a geological tang that persisted underneath the processed nitrogen, something the assembly's atmospheric system had never fully filtered out in the 7,000 years since the chamber was first sealed. She logged it as an ambient condition, assigned it a code, and moved on to the temperature reading. The temperature was the same as every other session. It had been the same as every other session for 34 years. She noted this as well. Threshold Assembly's hull material was compressed gas giant core, amber when light hit it straight on, something closer to burned copper when the chamber was full and the overhead panels dimmed for formal session. Every surface ran slightly warm to the eye. Dren had read, somewhere in her first year, that the original builders had chosen the material because it was the hardest substance they could mine at scale, and also because it was beautiful. And she had found it interesting that those two qualities had both survived 7,000 years of use, while almost everything else about the original builders had not. The 31st Grand Accord session had been underway for 6 days. 280 species. The full chamber, every tier occupied, every translation relay active. The ambient noise of that many different respiratory systems producing a low collective hum that Dren had learned, over 34 years, to filter out the way the atmospheric system filtered out the mineral smell. Almost. The Kethani delegation entered last. They always entered last. Grand Executor Verk Salyun led them to the primary floor in the arrangement Dren had come to recognize across 4 previous sessions. 6 aides in a tight formation behind him. His own position at the exact geometric center of the Kethani table. Nothing on the table's surface except the Dominion standard and a single data pad. His rank burns were visible from Dren's position in the 3rd observer tier, 8 clean lines on his left forearm and a 9th, slightly raised at the edges that had not yet fully settled. The 9th was recent. She logged it without comment. Dren's station was in the 3rd tier, observer left, with a clean sightline to the primary floor and the Terran table at mid-tier. She had held the same station for 11 sessions. She knew which translation relays ran half a second slow, which lighting panels flickered when the temperature in the upper tiers dropped, and precisely how long it took the chamber to go quiet after the session director called order. 42 seconds on average. Today it took 38. The Terran table held 4 people. Dren had noted this on day 1 and had not changed the entry since. 4 people, no ceremonial dress, mid-tier placement, technically correct under Accord seating protocols for a species of Earth's registration tier, and not a single concession beyond technically correct. The table itself was standard-issue assembly furniture. They had brought nothing to put on it except a water service and 1 personal item belonging to the delegation lead. Admiral Dava Kress sat at the center-left position. Lean, silver at the temples, wearing a service jacket that Dren's research had identified as the standard-issue version rather than the formal variation. Her cuffs were rolled back one precise turn, not two. One, the kind of adjustment made before a long sitting, not before a ceremony. The personal item was a flask, metal, well-used, dented on one side. Cress had placed it on her armrest on day one with the dent facing up, and it had occupied the same position every day since. Cress had not spoken in 6 days of session. Dren had logged this as a delegation preference. Some species conducted the first week of accord sessions in full observational silence before entering the record, and had marked it for follow-up if the pattern continued into week 2. This was day 6. The pattern had continued. She noted it again and cross-referenced it with the existing entry, which had the notation, no precedent found in 34-year archive for Terran delegation silence exceeding 3 days. She did not add to that notation. She moved on to the next item. The session director called the floor for new formal matters. Salyun rose before anyone else. He did not cross to the speaking position. He spoke from his seat, which was, technically, a protocol deviation and which Dren logged immediately in the flat declarative register that the Dominion used for administrative business. No warm-up, no formal acknowledgement of the chamber. The Kethani Dominion requires the administrative transfer of Corridor Solen, Salyun said. 6 systems, 28-day compliance window. The Dominion considers this a standard matter of regional consolidation and has prepared the relevant transfer documentation. He sat down. The chamber did not go quiet in 42 seconds. It went quiet immediately, the specific sound of 280 species stopping their ambient noise simultaneously, a silence that had texture to it, that Dren could feel in the back of her throat the way she could feel the mineral smell in the air. Salyun had not said annexation. He had not said occupation or subjugation or any of the words the Accord's formal protocols assigned to territorial actions. He had said administrative transfer and regional consolidation and compliance window, and the documentation sitting on his data pad had, Dren would learn later, been formatted as a budget line. The Terran table did not move. Terran Ambassador Ren Holt rose. He was not the delegation lead, Cress held that title, but he was the designated floor speaker, and he rose now with the careful deliberateness of someone who had been waiting for a specific moment to arrive. He said 7 words. Then he sat down. Dren replayed his statement 4 times in the first hour after session and still found it difficult to log cleanly. It was not a counteroffer. It was not a request for clarification or an invocation of Accord protocols governing territorial disputes. It was 7 words delivered in the flat, even tone of someone reading a line they had already memorized, and the 7 words were, "We have read the Accord carefully." That was all. Salyun's aide leaned to him immediately after. Dren caught the movement but not the words. Salyun's expression did not change. He made a small notation on his data pad. Elder Savath of the Renhari, seated in the senior observer position 2 tiers above Dren, closed both outer eyelids simultaneously. A Renhari gesture Dren had learned, years ago, meant something between witnessed, and I knew this was coming, and something else she had never found the right word for in any language she spoke. The session director called a recess. The Terrans had brought their own coffee. Dren noted this in her log during the recess with the same clinical precision she applied to everything else. It was not the standard assembly refreshment. The assembly service ran on a universal nutrient protocol acceptable to 73% of registered species, and coffee was not in the protocol. The Terran delegation had filed a nutritional preference accommodation request on day 1 and had been granted access to their own supply. Cress drank hers black. She had been drinking it the same way for 6 days. Dren's supervisor would later circle this line in the official report and note it as the only entry in the document that made him laugh. Dren did not, at the time of writing, know why it would be funny. She filed it and went on. The recess lasted 40 minutes. When the session resumed, Salyun had added 2 aides to the Kethani floor position, and his data pad now showed a secondary document open alongside the first. He had interpreted Holt's 7 words as the beginning of negotiations. He was wrong. Corridor Solen had been the subject of accurate geological surveys for 190 years. This was not unusual. The Accord maintained geological survey records for all registered transit corridors, standard practice, filed quarterly, available to any registered species upon request. The Corridor Solène filings were particularly thorough. 14 survey vessels over that period, each completing a full-spectrum geological assessment, each filing a report that confirmed the same basic profile: mineral-dense transit corridor, high dust particulate environment, stable formation structure, navigational hazards consistent with known parameters. The reports were accurate. They had been accurate for 190 years. What the reports did not state, what they had never stated in any of the 14 survey cycles, was the primary purpose of the survey vessels. The geological data was real. It had been collected carefully, filed correctly, and cross-referenced against previous surveys with the kind of methodical attention that produced clean records. Anyone reviewing the Corridor Solène survey archive would find exactly what they expected to find: 190 years of accurate science, filed on schedule, by ships with entirely legitimate survey designations. Dren would not learn any of this for another 23 days. Session Day 8. The chamber had settled into the pattern Dren recognized from long Accord sessions, the particular rhythm of institutional dispute, where the same arguments were approached from slightly different angles every day in the hope that repetition would eventually produce movement. The Kethani were very good at this. Salyun ran the floor with the confidence of a delegation that had conducted this exact process 8 times before and understood it as a variable with known parameters. He presented documentation. He referenced precedent. He used words like resolution and absorption in the precise way someone uses a word when they have decided that the word is now true regardless of what anyone else believes about it. The Terrans remained at their table. On day 9, Cress shifted her flask from armrest to table surface. Dren logged the change and could not find a reason for it. On day 12, Holt rose and said 11 words. He sat down. Dren logged the 11 words and cross-referenced them with the 7 words from day 1, looking for a pattern. She found one, but she could not identify what the pattern meant, so she filed it as an annotation and kept watching. On day 14, Salyun presented the transfer documentation formally. Proper Accord format, properly filed, properly stamped with the Dominion's administrative seal. It sat in the official record alongside Holt's 7 words and his 11 words and 6 days of Cress's silence, and it had the procedural weight of something that had already been decided. The Kethani had done this before. The Accord had never once stopped them. 260 years ago, a woman named Osara Ven had written a 9-page document. It was classified from the moment she finished it. It would remain classified for the next 260 years, which meant that no one in Threshold Assembly had read it. No one in the public Accord record had access to it, and Ven's name appeared in no historical archive that Dren had ever encountered in 34 years of institutional research. The document had a plain title. It identified a structural problem. The Accord's framework for managing territorial expansion was, Ven had written, designed for species operating at a particular scale of engagement, species that negotiated, that made demands, that occupied and withdrew and occupied again through the standard mechanisms of institutional pressure. The framework assumed that all parties wanted the same things from the process: time, recognition, procedural legitimacy. It assumed that a species seeking to protect its interests would do so by making its interests visible. Ven had identified this as a structural inadequacy. Not a flaw, an inadequacy. The Accord's framework was not broken. It did exactly what it was designed to do. It simply had not been designed with a particular question in mind, and Ven had spent 9 pages examining what would happen if someone asked that question differently. The document had been funded, across 18 consecutive administrations, as a geological survey. Ven had written the document. 18 administrations had funded it. No one had filed it publicly. The survey vessels had kept going to Corridor Solène every 14 months, and the geological data had kept being accurate, and the primary purpose of the vessels had never appeared in any report. On session day 17, Dren noted that Cress had rolled her cuffs back a second turn. She logged it. She did not know what it meant. Session day 19 arrived with a procedural development that Dren had been expecting. The formal Accord response window opened. requiring the Terran delegation to enter either a counterposition or a withdrawal acknowledgement within 72 hours. This was the mechanism that had ended the previous 8 Cathani territorial actions. The formal window produced either a negotiating position the Dominion could work with, or a withdrawal the Dominion could record as resolution. Holt rose at the 48-hour mark. He entered a counterposition. It was 3 sentences. Dren transcribed it directly and read it twice before logging it, because the 3 sentences did not match any counterposition format she had encountered in 34 years of Accord records. They did not negotiate. They did not invoke protective protocols or request mediating parties or propose revised boundary parameters. They referenced a geological survey cooperative. 6 species were named: the Renori, the Balani, the Vathisi, the Kalward, the Fesari, the Lurin. All 6 were listed in the Accord's public record as participants in a long-running geological survey cooperative focused on mineral corridor assessment in the outer transit zones. All 6 had their own tables in threshold assembly. None of them had spoken. On day 19, the same day Holt entered the counterposition, a vessel called the ISV Provisional filed its 14th calibration report for Corridor Solène. The manifest listed the Provisional as a geological survey vessel. The filing was accurate in every detail that Dren would eventually be able to verify. Hull classification, survey equipment inventory, transit log, all of it clean and correctly formatted, and exactly what a geological survey vessel was supposed to file. Captain Marsh had signed the report. He had noted, in the standard remarks field, that the calibration pass had been completed successfully and that all instruments were reading within normal parameters. What the remarks field did not note, what no remarks field in 14 calibration reports had ever noted, was that the Provisional's actual cargo was not geological survey equipment. 3,100 platforms. Recognition platforms, passive calibration design, distributed across Corridor Solène's entry vectors over 14 survey cycles in configurations that looked, on any scan that wasn't specifically looking for them, like a geological formation. The platforms had no active targeting signal. They emitted nothing. They had spent 14 calibration passes learning a single thing: the specific navigational broadcast frequency that Cathani capital ships had been using for 7,400 years. The broadcast was old enough that no one had changed it. It worked. It had worked for 7,400 years across 9 annexations, and there was no reason to believe it would ever stop working. At the end of Day 19's calibration pass, the Provisional's instruments recorded that the platforms had completed their passive calibration. Captain Marsh filed his geological report. He noted that all instruments were reading within normal parameters. He was not wrong. Session Day 21. Dren's log entry was longer than usual. She had spent the previous 2 days cross-referencing the 6 species named in Holt's counterposition against the Geological Survey Cooperative's membership records, and what she found was that the cooperative had been active for 12 cycles, about 40 years, with consistent membership, consistent survey focus, and consistent filing records that she could verify against the Accord's public archive in every particular. She also found that the cooperative's member vessels had, collectively, conducted survey operations in Corridor Solène 17 times in those 40 years, always filed correctly, always returned accurate geological data. 40 years. She sat with that number for a long time before she logged it. The session itself was routine. Salyun presented a second round of documentation. His tone had shifted, not dramatically, not in any way she could have pointed to precisely, but the confidence had acquired something underneath it that she logged, after some thought, as awareness that something is not following its expected shape. This was not a phrase she would normally use in an official log. She used it anyway, and then she cross-referenced it with the Day 1 notation about Holt's 7 words, and she left both entries standing without resolution. On the floor, Cress picked up the flask, looked at the dent, set it back down. She did not speak. Dren had found, in her 34 years of Accord records, 3 previous instances of a territorial action proceeding past Day 20 without resolution. In all 3 cases, the action had resolved by Day 28, either through formal withdrawal by the claimant or through acknowledgement and transfer by the responding party. The 28-day window was Accord standard. It was also, not coincidentally, the compliance window Solyun had named in his opening statement. On day 22, a series of supplementary documents arrived in the official session record. They were filed as attachments to the Geological Survey Cooperative's existing counterposition entry, procedural, quiet, the kind of filing that appeared in the record without announcement and sat there until someone read it. Dren read them. 290 vessels. The 6 named species, the Renori, the Balani, the Vathisi, the Colward, the Fesari, the Lurin, had each contributed vessels to what the filing described as a multi-species geological survey exercise in the outer transit zones. Training cycles, 12. Duration, 40 years. Current position of all vessels, not listed in the public filing. Dren looked for the current position of all vessels for 6 hours. She could not find it. What she found instead was a display terminal in the Terran delegation's support annex, visible briefly through the observation window during a session recess, showing a star map. 11 meters across. White dots arranged across corridor Solen's entry vectors. The display belonged to a Terran tactical officer whose name, Dren would later learn, was Vast. Vast had not looked at the map while Dren was watching. There was nothing to look at, apparently. The dots were already where they were supposed to be. Session day 24, one day before Drevik's console returned the wrong reading. Solyun had filed a formal procedural notice that morning. The Cathani Dominion's administrative record showed the compliance window at 4 days remaining, and the notice stated, in the flat declarative present tense that Solyun used for all things he had already decided were true, that the Dominion would proceed with administrative resolution if the transfer documentation was not countersigned within the window. Administrative resolution, not war, not military action. The word resolution used the way you'd use it for a budget line. Holt did not rise. Kress did not speak. At the recess, Dren watched Vast update the display. One of the white dots shifted slightly, a calibration adjustment, from the look of it, the kind of small correction that happened when a position was confirmed rather than estimated. Then Vast put a number on the screen alongside the map, 6 days. He said nothing. Dren looked at the 6-day figure and then at the 4-day window, and the arithmetic was not complicated. She ran it twice anyway, because the results of the arithmetic implied something she did not yet have language for, and she wanted to be certain she was reading it correctly. 6 days of buffer, 4 days remaining in the window. The calibration had already completed. Whatever was in corridor Solen had been ready for 2 days before the window opened. It would be ready for 2 days after it closed. The compliance window, the 28-day window that the Cathani Dominion had used in 8 previous territorial actions as the pressure mechanism that produced resolution, sat entirely inside a 6-day buffer that had been built around it. Dren sat with the arithmetic for a long moment. Then on the floor below, she watched Kress pick up the flask. The flask was metal, well used, dented on one side, an old dent she had noted on day 1 with edges worn smooth from years of handling. Kress held it for a full breath, the dent orienting in her palm the way it always did when she picked it up. She looked at it. She set it back down. Then she looked out the observation port at the dark, and she did not speak, and the session continued. Somewhere in corridor Solen, Drevik was 48 hours away from a reading that would come back wrong. The number was still 6. 6 days of buffer, 4 days remaining in the compliance window. 290 vessels holding position in the outer transit zones under a cooperative membership that did not technically require disclosure to the full Accord chamber. Dren had run the arithmetic 3 times the night before and written nothing additional in her log, because she had found that the arithmetic said everything, and she had no language yet for what it meant to say it. She arrived at her station before any other observer on day 25. The chamber was cold at that hour. The amber walls ran darker without the overhead panels at full strength, something closer to old rust than warm copper. She ran her opening log entry the same way she had run it for 34 years. Air quality, ambient temperature, session status. She got 3 words into the ambient temperature line and stopped. She looked at what she had written. She looked at the chamber. Then she deleted the 3 words, restarted the entry from the beginning, and kept going. Solyun arrived with 9 aides instead of 6. Dren logged this immediately. The Cathani floor position had held a consistent 6-aid formation across all 24 previous days, and the sudden expansion to 9 was the kind of change that could mean several things, none of which she could confirm from her position. She logged it as a procedural escalation, pending interpretation, and noted the time. The Terran table held the same 4 people it had held for 25 days. Cress had not changed anything about her position. Jacket, cuffs at one precise turn, flask on the armrest with the dent facing up. She had not spoken in 25 days of session. Dren had stopped updating the no-precedent notation because there was nothing new to add to it. Salyun rose at the opening of session. He did not cross to the speaking position. He had not crossed to the speaking position once in 25 days. The Cathani Dominion's compliance window closes in 4 days, he said. The administrative record shows no counter-signature. The Dominion considers this a completed matter and will proceed with regional entry into Corridor Solen on schedule. This is a statement of current fact, not a declaration of future intent. He sat down. Current fact, not future intent. Dren looked at the Terran table. Cress was looking at the observation port on the chamber's far wall, the one that showed a long view of the station's outer ring, and beyond it, the dark. Her expression was the same as it had been on day 1. Holt did not rise. 4 hours later, in Corridor Solen, Drevik's console returned the wrong reading. He was at his station, day 25, bearing 7 Mark II. The scan array swept. The mineral dust and trace ionization came back first, as always the corridor's baseline, the background that had been there for 4 billion years and would be there for 4 billion more. And then underneath it, distributed and even touching every bearing at once, the resonance. Drevik ran it again, same result. He checked the array calibration. He checked the log for interference artifacts. He pulled the natural formation catalog and began working through it manually because the answer was in there and he simply needed to find it. The console fan ran. The dust turned outside the viewport. He was 11 months into his posting, and he had never flagged an unclassified reading, and he was not going to start now. 2 minutes 3. The catalog returned nothing. Outside, in the corridor, the 187-ship Cathani formation completed its entry sequence. Standard subjugation broadcast on open frequency. The flat synthetic tone the Dominion used for administrative annexations. The same template across 9 territorial actions. A sound so routine that the translation relay logged it automatically without flagging it for review. Salyun's position was Ship 7, center formation, exactly where Doctrine placed the senior administrator during an uncontested entry. The formation moved into the corridor. The platforms woke up. Not all at once. Not with a visible signal or a targeting burst or any of the electromagnetic signatures that Drevik's array was calibrated to find. The platforms ran passive. They had always run passive, for 14 calibration cycles, for 39 years of careful positioning. And what they did, when the Cathani navigational broadcast reached them, was simply recognize it. 7,400 years. That was how long the broadcast had been in use. It had guided Cathani capital ships through 1,100 transit corridors across that span, never changed because it worked, never updated because there was no reason to update something that had never caused a problem. It caused a problem now. The platforms had spent 14 calibration passes learning exactly one thing, the shape of that broadcast, not to target it, not to lock on it, to recognize it the way a door recognizes a specific key, the way a system resolves after a long authentication sequence. The broadcast hit the first platform array. The recognition condition was met. The completion signal propagated. 3,100 platforms. No flash, no visible signature. Drevik's screen simply stopped returning the distributed resonance reading and began returning something else. 3,100 individual confirmed resolution signatures, appearing in sequence, one after another, a row of confirmation pings that his console had no classification for because no classification existed for what this was. He stared at it. The 6-minute window had been running for 4 minutes and 12 seconds. There was no targeting signal. There was no weapons lock, no active scan, no declaration broadcast on any frequency. The coalition vessels, 290 ships of 6 species, holding position at the corridor's outer vectors under survey cooperative designations that were technically accurate. closed the lateral approach angles in a formation that the Kethani navigational system logged as geological survey traffic. No alarm, no warning, no exit route that hadn't already been calculated. The 28-minute engagement was not an engagement in any sense Drevik's training had prepared him for. No shots were fired at the Kethani formation. The platforms did not fire. The coalition vessels held position. What the platforms had done, what 3,100 recognition completions meant in practice, was confirm the entry vectors as active, at which point the exit vectors had two options, the ones the framework had left open and nothing else. 187 ships took the open vectors. 187 ships exited Corridor Solen. Solyun's final transmission came out on the same open Grand Accord frequency he had used 25 days earlier when he addressed the threshold assembly chamber. The same frequency Holt's 7 words had entered the record on. The same frequency where administrative transfer and regional consolidation and compliance window had sat for 25 days without a direct answer. He used it because it was the frequency everyone monitored. It was the frequency the full Accord record would capture. He used it the way he had used everything in this process, as a statement of current fact. The transmission was 11 seconds long. It said that the Kethani Dominion was withdrawing its formation from Corridor Solen pending further review of the Survey Cooperative's jurisdictional filings. It said this in the same flat declarative register Solyun used for everything. It said nothing about the platforms. It said nothing about the 28-minute timeline. It said pending further review in the tone of someone who has decided that this phrase can hold the weight of an answer they cannot yet explain. He carried that answer home. Then Kress's reply came through. 9 words, open frequency, the same one Solyun had just used. Dren was at her station when it arrived. The session chamber had gone to recess. The formal session, the 25th day of the 31st Grand Accord session, had suspended pending the incoming transmission from Corridor Solen, and she was running her log and not looking at the floor when the audio relay opened. 9 words, in the flat, plain, direct register of someone who had been waiting 25 days to say them, and had decided that 9 was the right number. She replayed it. She replayed it again. The third time, she noticed that her hand had moved to pause the log without her telling it to. She replayed it a 4th time, a 5th. The 6th time, she was aware that she was counting and that the counting was a way of not doing anything else. The 7th time, she stopped the playback with 3 words remaining. She sat in the silence that came after. Then she rewound to the beginning. On the floor below, Elder Saveth stood. She had not been recognized. The session was still in recess, technically. The director had not called order. No one had the floor. Savath stood anyway in the senior observer position with both outer eyelids open for the first time in 25 days. We have 7,000 years of records in this building, Savath said. The Terrans read them before we did. She sat down. The chamber held 40 seconds of quiet, not the usual 42, not the 38 from day one, but something closer to the specific silence that follows a sentence no one in the room knew they needed to hear until it was already said. Dren did not log the duration. She found, when she looked at her entry field, that she had written nothing for the last 4 minutes. This had not happened in 34 years. She wrote Elder Saveth spoke without recognition. See attached audio. She attached the audio. She did not add anything else. The 6 coalition species would file updated cooperative membership documentation within 3 years. Not with the Accord, with Terran Strategic Command. 14 new species would join those filings in the same period, each submitting under the same geological survey framework, each receiving the same acknowledgement and the same quiet addition to the same long record that Asara Ven had started 260 years ago with 9 classified pages and a plain title. Ven had written the document. 18 administrations had funded it. 14 new species would sign it. Dren would not learn this for another 14 months. On day 25, all she knew was what she had heard in 9 words on an open frequency, and she was not yet ready to write them down. Corporal Yina Sia had a posting she did not talk about. This was not unusual in the formations that had trained under the framework. The survey cooperative had crews from 6 species, and most of them had something in their service record that appeared as a geographic designation rather than a named action. because named actions required formal declarations, and the framework had never produced one. CEO's record showed 40 months of geological survey operations in the outer transit zones. It showed correctly. She was at a viewport on the ISV provisional when the exit pings finished. Not all 187 at once. One after another, the Kethani formation completing its exit sequence through the open vectors, the ones the framework had left open, calculated, and specific, because the point was not destruction and it had never been destruction. CEO watched the sensor display until the last ping resolved, and then she looked out the viewport at the corridor dust catching the station's running lights. Amber in the dark the same way the threshold assembly walls were amber, and she reached into her jacket. She did not cheer. She did not say anything to the crew members standing nearby. Whatever they were feeling, she could feel it in the room, the particular collective stillness of people who had trained for something for a very long time and were only now beginning to understand what it meant that it had worked. She let it sit in the air without adding to it. She unfolded the photograph. It was old enough that the fold lines had softened into the paper. A river delta, brown water, pale sky, the flat light of a morning that had happened a long time ago somewhere she had not been back to in 40 months. She had carried it through every calibration pass, every survey filing, every day of a posting that did not have a name. She held it in both hands. She looked at it. She did not put it away. In the threshold assembly chamber, the session would reconvene in 11 minutes. The director would call order. The official record would reflect the Kethani withdrawal and the coalition's jurisdictional filings and Holt's formal counterposition, and it would do so in the clean institutional language that the Accord used to hold things that were too large for any other kind of container. Dren would complete her log. She would file it on time. She would note the air quality and the ambient temperature as she always did, and she would add a notation at the end that her supervisor would read 3 times before he called her to ask whether she had intended it. She had, but that was 11 minutes away. Right now, Cress was at the observation port. The flask was in her hand, the same flask she had placed on the armrest on day 1, the same one she had carried through 28 years and 3 postings, and one war that appeared in her service record as a geographic designation. The dent caught the observation port light the specific way it caught light at this hour, when the station's rotation put the port at a particular angle to the nearest star. She had held this flask long enough that the dent had worn smooth in exactly the shape of her thumb. She was not moving. She was not looking at anything Dren could see. Not the display, not the chamber floor, not the amber of the walls she had spent 25 days not reacting to. She was looking at something that was not in the room. The flask sat in her hand. The dent caught the light.